Okay, we're here with Mark Hutchinson. Mark, thank you so much for coming on Energy Insights. It's great to get you on here.
Thank you very much for your time today.
So Mark, I wanted to talk about all things to do with offshore wind energy in South Korea, and particularly based on a relatively new report that's been published by your organization, GWEC. But I'm wondering first if you can give us a brief background on who you are, your career, or anything else you think is important.
Sure, thank you. So I'm a director in the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC's Asia policy team. I've been in Asia for 30 years, so I've seen quite a few changes, mostly positive. And I come out of a more traditional energy background, having been a consultant with a number of the global consulting firms, for example, with McKinsey and IHS Markit, which is now part of S&P Global. So I've looked across the entire energy sector, from gas to oil to power, even coal at times. And of course, in the last decade or so, much greater focus on renewables. So I've had quite a wide background. And now I'm trying to bring what I can to the wind space.
So Mark, I think it's a good segue into South Korea and also their current trajectory with renewables, for example. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the country first, to just get a lay of the land. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, can you tell us a little bit about what the energy sector there looks like right now? So, for example, how are renewables in particular stacking up against, say, coal or gas?
Okay. Korea is, as I think most people are aware, is a very advanced industrialized economy. They have a very advanced industry. They, for example, are already very active in the offshore wind supply chain, exporting foundations and towers, for example, to Taiwan. So they've got a very strong industrial base upon which they start. They also, for supply, they have nuclear, coal, and LNG. And I think the challenge for Korea is that almost all of the coal and all of the LNG is imported. So they're a very, very import-dependent country. So I think one of the interesting things for them about renewables is that when they build solar and wind and other types of renewables, it increases both their energy security, but it also reduces sort of their import dependency. And I think, over the last few years, with the war in Ukraine and the extreme volatility in the hydrocarbon markets, importers like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and others have been hit very hard. So there's an additional incentive for them to do renewables because it increases their energy security.
And how is that progressing in general? I mean, or maybe a better question would be, what kind of ambition has the country, like Korea, has already set so far in, let's say, offshore wind, for example?
But the country has set an extremely ambitious target of 14.3 gigawatts or 14,300 megawatts of power of offshore wind installed by 2030. It is very ambitious, so it's going to be somewhat challenging to achieve that. But I think one of the key challenges in South Korea is they have, as I mentioned, this very large industrial base. And so what you're seeing the supply chains globally are being pushed very hard to decarbonize, and the same pressure is being felt by a lot of, the industrial players in Korea. So there's a strong, for example, push for RE100 and other types of programs that would decarbonize the Korean industry. Now, the problem for Korea is Korea is not a particularly large country. It's also a fairly mountainous country. And the land that they have that is arable for farming is farmed. So if you go to Korea and you go outside Seoul, you will see farms anytime there's a flat piece of land, or you will see buildings and houses, etc. So it's very land constrained. And so the idea that there will be very, very large scale onshore solar or even onshore wind is challenging. There will be, and there is, but the potential is significantly less than what there is for offshore wind. So if you're looking 10 years or 20 years from now, and you're looking at a heavily decarbonized South Korean power market, there isn't really much choice other than to have a very heavy component of that being met by offshore wind.
Do you think that there's an argument to say that there could be a market that opens up for clean energy imports from, say, neighboring countries that do have a bit more land, or that's a bit more, flat in terms of, say, installing, for example, solar power and things like that?
Possibly, but if you look at South Korea's neighbors, North Korea in the north, China kind of to the west, probably not going to see a huge amount of interconnection there. I think to meet sort of the needs that you're hinting at would be the green hydrogen. And this is something that the Koreans are very actively involved in, doing everything from R&D to small scale pilot projects. So again, I would definitely watch this space, because wind and solar only blow certain times and the sun only shines at certain times. So you need some sort of way of balancing. And I think hydrogen is a very good way of that. So I think the Koreans are looking at sort of the import of hydrogen as a way to match the variability that they will see from the wind and solar.
And of course, when we're talking about, for example, offshore wind, and I think this is a good way to get into what this new GWEC report says, is about getting buy-in from the locals.
Yes.
Especially coastal communities as well. So now, you've mentioned just earlier that the government has set this really ambitious target for offshore wind, but it has received some pushback from local communities in coastal areas in Korea. So I'm just wondering why that is, and, is there, how does that stack up to, say, acceptance to other conventional sources of, say, onshore wind, for example?
First of all, this is in a way, this is a normal thing, right? Anytime you encroach on somebody's way of earning a living, whether it is a farmer onshore and you want to put a solar project or an onshore wind project there, or you're trying to build a transmission line to deliver clean energy to a major urban area like Seoul, you have to take land. You have to use land, or out in the ocean, you use seabed. And this is new, right? This is not something that's ever been done before. There's never been a major offshore wind project done in Korea, and in most of Asia, to be clear, except in Taiwan or China. So these sort of local acceptance issues are expected, and the industry has a series of best practices to address them. And I think one of the key things is very, very early engagement with the fisheries and the local communities, working with them to build a level of understanding and trust. And what we always encourage our members to do, and our members, for those of you who don't know, are all the major OEMs globally, pretty much every major developer globally, and a lot of the mid-size and smaller developers. And so the idea is that when you go into a new country, one of the first things that you do is you go start talking to the communities where you're thinking about putting your projects. And again, I say thinking about, not deciding, but thinking. And so you go and you really have to engage them, and you absolutely must have local language capabilities, and you need to put people in the markets near where the communities are so they can be part of the communities. It's a long process. It takes money. It takes a bit of patience, and it takes a lot of trust building and a lot of listening. Because I think the worst case scenario is a developer, which I'm sure none of our members would ever do, but say a developer goes to a place, they pick a site, they don't tell the fisheries, they don't communicate enough with the local communities, and then they announce a joint venture and they're going to start construction and whatever. That is the worst way for the communities to hear about it. And so what we've tried to do in these reports, and it's certainly best practice for many of our members, is how do you do this? What are some examples of where it's worked, and what you can learn from that? Areas where it hasn't worked, and again, what you can learn from that. And so the two reports that we did on both the fisheries and coexistence with them, as well as the coastal economic regeneration, try to highlight the best ways of doing this and really the ways of bringing those communities, into the decision-making process so they feel like they have a level of ownership. And in Korea, they have an interesting option, which gets you extra points in the auction. And that is if you have local ownership within these projects. So they're encouraging effectively you as a developer to give the local communities an equity piece that and it's a complicated process, but the idea is you bring them in as owners. And the idea there is if you're an owner, you're much less likely to resist it. You will also, of course, earn a revenue stream from the project as well as an owner. So it's a way of building trust, understanding, acceptance, as well as providing some level of financial compensation.
And if we were to, let's say, for example, in a perfect scenario, we were to iron out all these, issues. I'm just wondering what kind of benefits, in your opinion, do you see something like offshore wind bringing to Korea as it tries to decarbonize? I mean, you mentioned some of these earlier, is in terms of energy security, for example, but I'm more focused, maybe if we could focus a little bit on the domestic picture and how that would affect the economy.
Yeah, so some interesting facts about Korea is Korea has one of the lowest population growth rates in the world. And just as an example, the population growth rate in Korea is half the population growth rate in Japan, which is already among the lowest in the world. So you've got a country that's facing a very significant demographic challenge. And as you find in many countries, in the rural areas, in the coastal areas as well, young people move to the cities because of jobs and opportunity. And I think if you look in Europe, and again, some of the older industrial areas of Europe, you will see that when offshore wind came, it revitalized the ports. They built, storage facilities, they built blade factories, they built wind turbine assembly plants. And these bring local jobs to, let's just call them sort of brownfield sites, older industrial areas that had seen decline. And of course, this has multiplier effects. So, all the workers at the blade factory go shopping, they go out to eat, and, it has this fairly significant revitalization impact across a broad sector of the economy. And so combining the very severe demographic declines in Korea, the movement to the cities because of no jobs, offshore wind, which will require, operations and maintenance for 25 years, as well as the construction, the port development, all of that. It brings a lot of economic development to the regions, which is, I think, something that is desperately wanted in Korea.
And that, I guess, harkens back to, actually, it reminds me of a quote that was said in the report about, I think it was revitalizing existing assets. Is that kind of what you're fleshing out right now? Exactly.
So if you think about it, there are a lot of these ports that may have been built for fishing, or, if you get down to Ulsan and Busan in southern Korea, they're fairly industrialized ports already with lots of major manufacturing. Again, you'll see expansion there, but closer to where the wind farms actually are, you will actually see a lot of the O&M operations and maintenance activities, which have a very long life, that will likely train up and hire a lot of the local people. So that's, the idea is these areas, economically have been in decline or not growing. And this is a way to bring growth back and keep younger people from moving out of the regions.
Do you think that there will be at all any kind of supply bottlenecks if this is to kind of scale up in the way you're talking? I'm just thinking about, the current supply chain issues in some renewable supply chains, going into Europe and things like that, especially to do with the wind sector. How do you see that all kind of developing going forward?
I think we're very, very positive on the Korean supply chain because, as I mentioned earlier, they've already got a very significant industrial base. And if you go and you talk to some of the shipyards who would be building a lot of the substations, the foundations, the towers, they're actually fairly well booked out for the next few years. And so, you're going to see even more growth coming from this. So you've already got this extremely strong marine capability in Korea. They have significant shipbuilding capabilities. So all of this is just going to be expanded even more. For example, as I mentioned before, Korea's already exporting towers and foundations to Taiwan, and we just expect that to continue. And of course, they'll make a lot of the foundations and towers for their own markets.
And I guess, would you say that this has potential also to put a significant dent in the dependency that Korea does have right now on fossil fuels, for example?
Yes, but it takes time, right? Because the 14.3 gigawatt target by 2030 is quite challenging to meet. Say you get in six gigawatts, that will make a dent. But it's really, you're going to be in 2035 and 2040 before you're starting to make very significant dents in sort of the consumption of fossil fuels. But, if you don't start now, you just push everything out, another 3, 4, 5 years. So I think the government feels a certain sense of urgency. As I mentioned, it's an economic competitiveness issue as well. RE100 and a lot of the multinationals who source are really pushing their supply chains to decarbonize. So the government, to a certain extent, doesn't have a choice if they want to remain, the very, very relevant, international economic competitor that they are today. They've got to decarbonize.
Do you think that they've got the right policy setting right now in Korea? Given that they've, kind of gone into this new government that's, I guess, been a little bit, reserved on their renewable push compared to the previous administration in Korea. So do you think that the right policy environment is there right now?
It's evolving. So there was a special offshore wind act. There were a couple of them that were introduced in the 21st National Assembly, which ended earlier this month or late last month, I can't remember. And unfortunately, the bill didn't pass. The bill made it to the final stages. There was a compromise between the two major parties, the Democratic Party and the People's Power Party, as well as with the ministry, with Moti. But the political process just couldn't pass it before the end of the 21st National Assembly. The 22nd National Assembly has just seated, and they will be assigning committees and other things. So there's going to be a process. In the way that the Korean legislative calendar works, it will take a minimum of 6 months to go through all the committees, the Justice Committee, the Energy Committee, etc. So we're expecting probably not until another 6 months, if not a year, for the bill to pass. Now, the bill not passing is not the end of the world, but it certainly, is a very positive signal to the industry that there is a strong, support by government for the industry. So it's a little bit of a bump in the road, but in general, the government is quite supportive because, again, the government doesn't see a choice. If the government wants to decarbonize it in a significant way, they have two choices, and that's what they've chosen, which is nuclear and offshore wind. We would, of course, prefer to see a more offshore wind focus, but we don't. It's Korea. They get to decide their politics, so they're pushing very hard on nuclear and offshore wind, and they don't. And again, they're doing it because they don't have a choice.
And Mark, if you were to, for example, if we were to start tomorrow, if in your opinion, if Korea were to start tomorrow, how would you go about kind of making the situation a bit easier for offshore wind to kind of go up? What kind of things would you see like to change or, remain the same, for example, if things were starting to change tomorrow? What would be your way of, moving on?
Well, that's a very difficult question. In general, I do think that the government is doing a lot of the right things. This special act came very, very close to passing, and some other. The reasons it didn't pass had nothing to do with offshore wind, and so we've been told that by many people. So the implication of that is that the government actually is supportive, but because of it was constrained by some other political debates. The offshore wind kind of got thrown into a package that didn't get passed. So I think we would encourage the passage of the bill, certainly within the next year, if not within the next 6 months. And then also, I think, continued support, working with the industry. We are working with the National Assembly. We are working with the Korean Wind Energy Industry Association, which is our local partner. We are having our large wind summit in November in Incheon, in partnership with the Korean Wind Energy Industry Association. And so what we're doing is we're offering, for example, to the National Assembly to run a series of seminars, bringing in experts, answering their questions. How did country X, Y, and Z deal with fisheries, deal with coastal economic regeneration, deal with supply chain development, deal with grid development issues. So there's a lot of issues that we're addressing that the government is very actively involved. So I think the Korean government is generally doing a fairly good job in this. They could always move faster. We always want the governments to move faster, if you think about it.
It's the perennial question.
Our head of Asia and our CEO were there last week. I was there last month with a colleague. We've hired a country manager. There's a lot of activity, and we're having our large summit there in November. So there's a lot of activity that the government is very actively involved in. So I'm reasonably positive on Korea. Just a few more things to kind of get pushed over the line.
Well, Mark, being mindful of your time, I just want to, again, thank you so much for coming on. I'm just wondering, before we do sign off, is there anywhere that you would like to point listeners to go to, for example, like a website or any social media accounts, perhaps the report itself?
Yeah, please go to GWEC.net or GWEC.net. You can have access to all of our publicly available reports, including the two on Korea, our global offshore wind report, as well as our global wind report. So pretty much any data that you want on the global wind industry, you can find there, as well as lots of best practices about what you can do. And then obviously, please feel free to reach out to us. We're very happy to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. It was great to have you on here. If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.